Good morning. It's nice to be with everybody today. I'm sitting outside. There might be some road noise you hear going by. It's about 11 o'clock in the morning, 91 degrees, headed for a high of 108. And boy, I love that southwest heat. If you haven't been out this way, you should take an opportunity to do it. It's just a different sort of place, different sort of heat, and I got plenty of it. This first module video is intended to provide a brief introduction to Chapter 6. I won't be looking at any problems during this video, but I will in the next 2 or 3 videos that get posted. This first video, we'll just talk about the basics of Chapter 6, what we'll cover in Chapter 6, and why Chapter 6 is important. First of all, Chapter 5 was full of tools to evaluate individual projects, individual investment alternatives. And in Chapter 6, we'll take those same tools and we'll apply those to evaluate what we call mutually exclusive alternatives. For example, you might be building a building, and you need to select from among a set of HVAC providers. And each one will specify the equipment. They'll specify, you get some estimate of annual maintenance. You'll get some estimate of the life of the asset. You'll get some estimate of how much your energy costs might be. So you may be presented with 4 or 5 of these, and your task is to select the best, the one that is most economically attractive. That's what we do in Chapter 6. So we will apply the tools we used in Chapter 5, and we'll take those tools and we'll apply those to evaluating multiple alternatives to select the best one. There are really no new tools in Chapter 6, maybe a new process or two. Mostly it's knowing how to make those decisions. First of all, let me discuss mutually exclusive alternatives. Anytime you're in a corporate environment, or even if you're an entrepreneur and this is just your business, you're going to be faced with ways to invest your funds and projects. Some of these investments might be independent. Independent investment projects might be something like, let's say you're an entrepreneur and you have a new company. And one way you might invest money is in a new marketing campaign. The other way you might invest money is in particular software tools to do the job. Now these are not really related. You could do one, you could do both, you could do none of those, and instead invest your money in a different way. These are independent alternatives. We also then have dependent alternatives, and that is, let's say we have 2 alternatives, A and B. B would be dependent on A if your decision to invest in B required that you had already decided to invest in A. Both of these, independent and dependent alternatives, are things that we will not specifically be considering in Chapter 6. There are ways that you can take those alternatives and convert them to mutually exclusive alternatives. Suffice it to say at this point that we won't worry about that, those tools, the ways that you do that. We will simply focus on mutually exclusive alternatives. These alternatives are those alternatives that from which you select one and only one from the set of alternatives. When you select one, it eliminates the others automatically because they all perform the same product, the same service, they provide the same investment, the same functionality, and therefore you only need one. You don't need more than one. So those will be mutually exclusive, and our goal in Chapter 6 is to look at tools and techniques that will allow us to select from among a set of these alternatives. There may be 2, there may be a dozen. Actually, we won't look at a dozen. I think if we can show that we can select from among a set of 3 or 4 mutually exclusive alternatives, that will be sufficient to demonstrate that we know what we're talking about. And typically, you're not faced with a dozen. There are ways to eliminate many alternatives out of hand, just right from the start. There are two types of alternatives that we'll be considering here: cost alternatives and investment alternatives. Cost alternatives are those alternatives. Sorry, I got interrupted there unexpectedly, so I've kind of forgotten where I left off. But here's where I'm going to pick up. In Chapter 6, we'll work with two different kinds of alternatives: cost alternatives and investment alternatives. We won't combine the two, so whenever you're making a decision to select from among a set of mutually exclusive alternatives, they will either all be cost alternatives or they will all be investment alternatives. Cost alternatives are those alternatives for which there is little or no positive cash flow. And these are things that are must-be-done sorts of alternatives. The HVAC example that I presented just a few minutes ago is one example where if you're building a building, an HVAC system is required. Therefore, when you select from among the set, you must select one of those particular alternatives. It's required, and you won't get any positive cash flow from that. You might make some lame, distant arguments about how that particular HVAC system may make your employees work harder or better or whatever, but that's nonsense. All of our cost alternatives are strictly that. The only positive cash flows that might present themselves could possibly be in the market value at the end of life situation. So you might purchase an HVAC system, and when it's pretty much finished, maybe there's some way that you can unload it for some scrap income, or perhaps some used system that you can pawn off on some poor unsuspecting, recipient, where they may pay you some money for some positive cash flow. But by and large, the cash flows will be negative. Investment alternatives, on the other hand, are alternatives that will present you with income that provide a return. This was most, if not all, of the problems we looked at from Chapter 5. These alternatives will have positive cash flows, and you would be expected to earn a particular return. So the present worth of the cash flows must be greater than 0 at the MAR in order for any particular alternative to be attractive. The rate of return must be greater than the MAR for these alternatives to be attractive. So with investment alternatives, you could select them or not. The alternatives might be attractive or they might not be attractive. You would not have to select any of these alternatives if none of them met your investment requirements. So, for investment alternatives, and make sure you write this down and you get this, for investment alternatives, one alternative that typically remains unnamed is the do-nothing alternative, and that is you can do nothing with your investment. You can sit on your money because we always assume that you can earn the minimum attractive rate of return on an investment. So we could take that money and wherever the source of our minimum attractive rate of return is, we can always put our money in that to earn that return. Perhaps it's different sorts of projects somewhere else. Perhaps it's some sort of fund that we've established. Whatever the case may be, that's irrelevant to us in terms of evaluating the mutually exclusive alternatives that are in front of us. So that's those two types of mutually exclusive alternative sets that we'll be considering in Chapter 6. There are some other complications that we'll examine as we go through the chapter. One of the big ones is whether the alternatives that we consider have equal lives or they have unequal lives. That is, we might be looking at a set of alternatives, all of which have the same length of service, the same life of the asset that we may be investing in. Those cases can be particularly straightforward to evaluate, as you'll see in the next video. The unequal lived alternatives seem very complicated, and indeed we need to make some reasonable assumptions so that we can properly evaluate these alternatives. But again, it's really not overly complicated, and there's some straightforward rules that we'll follow to do that. Let's see. That's about it, I think, for the intro module here. I would suggest that you read through the first couple of sections of Chapter 6. It'll talk about mutually exclusive alternatives as opposed to the independent and dependent types of alternatives. And it will briefly introduce the methods we'll use. Again, we'll be using all the tools from Chapter 5. We won't compare alternatives necessarily based on payback, but we will compare them on present worth, future worth, annual worth. We will do some comparison with rates of return. That's a big watch out. This is a big danger spot. And while we use the rate of return for these alternatives, you need to always keep in mind, always, this is another cardinal sin of engineering economic analysis, is if you compare alternatives by comparing their rates of return. It's a fallacy to believe you can do that. It is the case that sometimes you'll be right. It is also the case that sometimes you'll be wrong. So just keep this in mind. Again, write this one down. You never want to compare a rate of return to anything except the MAR. That's the only comparison you should ever make for any rate of return, is the rate of return for an individual alternative compared to the MAR. And you'll see in not the next video, but the next one, that this particular technique called incremental analysis provides an interesting way to do that, and really is the only legitimate way to use the internal rate of return for comparison. So that's the introduction to Chapter 6. This really is kind of a the beginning of the rubber meets the road analysis. With Chapter 6, we are now ready to go out into the wild and look at alternatives and make decisions that we can make recommendations to management on how to invest their funds. We'll have that at the end of Chapter 6. The only remaining chapter then in this class is Chapter 7. And in Chapter 7, we consider the effect of taxes on our investments. Taxes can be considerable. It changes the way we look at our investments. We'll have to look at some accounting principles. But in the very end, even when we figure out our taxes and the after-tax cash flows that go along with the taxes, we will still, in the end, then look at comparing mutually exclusive alternatives using the same tools that we learn in Chapter 6. So this is fundamental, and I think you'll find Chapter 6 is an easy extension to Chapter 5, with perhaps the caveat that incremental analysis can be a bit confusing, but we'll get there, and Cookie will be able to answer any questions you have about that. Okay, be on the lookout for the next module, where we'll go through an example problem, and I'll provide you with a spreadsheet that has the example problems in there, and we'll go through those one at a time with different videos.